April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above the farmlands of northern France, through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Werner Schröer studied the ungainly shapes climbing laboriously toward his formation. The veteran pilot of Jagdgeschwader 26 couldn't suppress the smirk that spread across his face beneath his oxygen mask. These were the new American fighters making their combat debut over occupied Europe, and they looked absolutely ridiculous. "The Americans are flying barrels," Schröer radioed to his wingman, his voice tinged with genuine amusement. Below them, 16 P-47 Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group lumbered upward in tight formation, their massive radial engines straining against more than 7 tons of aircraft. To German eyes accustomed to the sleek lines of Spitfires and the nimble Soviet fighters they'd faced on the Eastern Front, these corpulent American machines appeared almost comical. Barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed too small for their massive bodies, propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory. The Germans laughed that morning. They called them Tonnen, which meant barrels or tanks in German, mocking the bulbous shape. Some called them flying milk bottles, imagining these crude American contraptions waddling through the sky like overweight cargo haulers pretending to be fighters. The veteran aces who'd been flying since Poland in 1939 shook their heads at the sight. What were the Americans thinking? Did they truly believe these flying bathtubs could challenge the finest fighter pilots in the world? What those German pilots didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly imagined as they positioned for their attack runs that April morning, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these objects of derision would transform into instruments of absolute terror. The 850 caliber Browning machine guns nestled in those broad wings would become the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of their destruction were already loaded and ready. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. The transformation from laughingstock to nightmare would be written in tracers and blood across the skies of Europe. It would be a story of industrial might overwhelming tactical brilliance, of quantity and quality merging into unstoppable superiority, and of how German laughter turned to screams as they discovered what synchronized American machine guns could do to an aircraft at 400 yards. This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and how it buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead and fire. Birth of a beast. The P-47 Thunderbolt emerged from panic and desperation in the summer of 1940. As German fighters swept across France with terrifying efficiency, Alexander Kartveli sat in his office at Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, holding urgent specifications from the United States Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best fighters. What Kartveli designed instead was something that would redefine what was possible in aviation. Kartveli was a Georgian immigrant, born in Tiflis in what was then part of the Russian Empire. He'd fled the Bolshevik Revolution and made his way to America, where his engineering genius found fertile ground. Working alongside Alexander de Seversky, another Russian expatriate and World War I veteran, Kartveli had already designed the P-35 and P-43 fighters. But nothing in his previous work had prepared the aviation world for what he was about to create. "It will be a dinosaur," Kartveli admitted to his design team during the early planning sessions. "But it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." He understood the criticism that would come. The aircraft he was designing would be massive, heavy, and seemingly at odds with every accepted principle of fighter design. European philosophy emphasized lightweight interceptors optimized for climb rate and turning performance. Kartveli was throwing that entire philosophy into the trash bin. The heart of his design was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine. This monster of engineering was an 18-cylinder radial power plant producing 2,000 horsepower, more raw power than any fighter engine then in service. But power alone wasn't enough at high altitude, where the thin air starved conventional engines of oxygen. This is where Kartveli's true genius manifested. He designed the entire aircraft around a massive turbo supercharger system that would feed the engine compressed air even at altitudes where other fighters gasped and wheezed. The turbo supercharger installation was revolutionary and complex. Exhaust gases from the engine were ducted back through pipes running the length of the fuselage to a turbine mounted behind the cockpit. This turbine spun at incredible speeds, driving a compressor that forced outside air into the engine under pressure. The system essentially allowed the P-47 to maintain sea-level performance at altitudes approaching 30,000 feet. But this sophistication came at a price. The ducting alone filled nearly the entire belly of the aircraft, giving it that pregnant, bulging appearance that would inspire so much mockery. The XP-47B prototype first took to the air on May 6, 1941, with Republic's chief test pilot, Lowry Brabham, at the controls. Everyone who saw it on the ground was stunned by its size. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and pilot, it tipped the scales at over 13,000 pounds. For comparison, the Supermarine Spitfire weighed roughly 6,000 pounds fully loaded. The P-47 was more than twice as heavy as what many considered the finest fighter in the world. Test pilots approaching the Thunderbolt for the first time invariably asked the same question: "This thing actually flies?" Their skepticism was understandable. The aircraft looked less like a fighter and more like a freight train with wings. The massive radial engine dominated the nose, requiring a long cowling that restricted forward visibility on the ground. The cockpit sat high up on the fuselage, perched like an afterthought on top of all that machinery. The wings, while larger than they appeared, seemed disproportionately small for the aircraft's bulk. But fly it did, and magnificently so. When Brabham opened the throttle on that first flight, the P-47 demonstrated performance that shocked everyone involved in the program. It didn't just fly. It rocketed into the sky with power that felt almost violent. The test report noted speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, faster than almost any fighter then in service. More impressively, the aircraft maintained excellent control response despite its size. The massive engine mount and sturdy construction meant it could pull G-forces that would have torn apart lighter fighters. The turbo supercharger's performance exceeded even optimistic projections. At 27,000 feet, where German fighters began to struggle, the P-47's engine was still producing full rated power. At 30,000 feet, it could still accelerate and climb while enemy fighters wallowed like fish out of water. This high-altitude dominance would prove absolutely critical in combat. But first, the aircraft had to overcome a host of teething problems that nearly killed the program. Engine fires plagued early test flights. The complex turbo supercharger system leaked, overheated, and occasionally failed catastrophically. The massive propeller created torque forces that could flip the aircraft on its back during takeoff if the pilot wasn't careful. Landing gear struts collapsed under the tremendous weight. Radio systems failed. The oxygen delivery system malfunctioned at altitude. And most alarmingly, several pilots discovered compressibility, a poorly understood aerodynamic phenomenon that occurred when the aircraft approached the speed of sound in a dive. Control surfaces would freeze, rendering the aircraft temporarily uncontrollable as shock waves formed on the wings. Republic's engineers worked frantically to address each problem. They reinforced the landing gear, revised the turbo supercharger ducting, improved the electrical systems, and redesigned the oxygen equipment. But they couldn't do much about compressibility, which was a fundamental limitation of propeller-driven aircraft approaching transonic speeds. Pilots would simply have to learn to live with it, though learning to recover from a compressibility-induced dive would claim several lives during training. By early 1942, the first production P-47Bs began rolling off the assembly line at Farmingdale. The Army Air Corps had already ordered hundreds of the fighters based on projected performance, a risky gamble on an unproven design. These early aircraft went to the 56th Fighter Group, which would become forever linked with the Thunderbolt's legend. But before glory came blood, as the 56th discovered that learning to fly the P-47 could be deadlier than facing the Luftwaffe. Training with Thunder Major Hubert Zemke stood beside the runway at Bridgeport, Connecticut, watching another P-47 cartwheel across the grass in a ground loop, its landing gear crumpling like tinfoil. This was the 18th fatal accident in less than 4 months. 18 pilots dead, 41 aircraft destroyed. And his unit hadn't even left for England yet. The 56th Fighter Group was bleeding pilots faster than the Luftwaffe could have managed. And they were doing it to themselves. Zemke, known as Hub to his men, was a hard-eyed realist who'd spent time as an observer in Russia and understood modern air combat better than most American officers. He'd initially despised the P-47. The aircraft killed more Americans in training than Germans would in the first months of combat. It ground-looped on landing when pilots failed to compensate for the tremendous propeller torque. It torque-rolled on takeoff if you weren't aggressive enough with the rudder, and it dove with such enthusiasm that young pilots regularly found themselves in compressibility dives, their controls frozen as the ground rushed up to meet them. The cockpit alone overwhelmed new pilots. Unlike the simple, almost Spartan interiors of earlier fighters, the P-47's instrument panel looked like something from a bomber. There were engine instruments, turbo supercharger gauges, oxygen system indicators, radio controls, weapons switches, and a bewildering array of other systems that all needed monitoring. The turbo supercharger alone required constant attention, with its wastegate needing manual adjustment to maintain proper boost pressure at different altitudes. But those who survived the brutal learning curve discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would eventually claim 27 aerial victories, remembered his first solo flight in the P-47 with crystal clarity decades later. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive," he recalled. "The power was unbelievable. When you advanced the throttle, you didn't ease forward, you launched. You didn't fly the P-47, you aimed it and held on while it bludgeoned its way through the sky." The aircraft's room interior became legendary among pilots. Unlike the cramped cockpits of the Spitfire or Messerschmitt, the P-47's cockpit was genuinely spacious. Pilots joked that you could walk around during combat, and while that was an exaggeration, the extra space was appreciated during 8-hour missions at altitude. The seat was comfortable, the visibility once airborne was excellent, and the whole cockpit felt less like a fighter and more like a luxurious aerial office. One pilot compared it to sitting in a lounge chair, which seemed absurd for a combat aircraft but was absolutely accurate. By January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group boarded the HMS Queen Elizabeth for the voyage to England. They left behind their battered P-47Bs, expecting to receive new aircraft upon arrival. What awaited them at their base in England were shiny new P-47Cs, improved versions with an 8-inch fuselage extension that improved handling and made engine changes much faster. But the pilots remained skeptical. They'd lost too many friends to the big fighter. They'd heard the jokes from RAF pilots who called it the 7-ton milk bottle. They knew they'd be facing the most experienced fighter pilots in the world, veterans who'd been in continuous combat since 1939. The 4th Fighter Group, composed largely of former RAF Eagle Squadron pilots who'd flown Spitfires, was even more vocal in their dismay. These were Americans who'd volunteered to fight with the British before America entered the war. They'd flown the nimble, beautiful Spitfire against the Luftwaffe and loved every minute of it. Now they were being forced to transition to this massive, ungainly beast. Don Blakesley, one of the 4th's most experienced pilots, summed up the general opinion succinctly. "It ought to dive. It sure can't climb." Their first missions did nothing to improve morale. On March 10, 1943, the 4th Fighter Group flew their first operational sweep over France. Radio malfunctions made coordination nearly impossible. Several aircraft suffered engine problems. The Luftwaffe ignored them completely, focusing on the bombers instead. The mission was a technical failure, and the pilots returned to base thoroughly unimpressed with their new mount. But Zemke saw something the complaining pilots didn't. He'd studied the aircraft's specifications carefully, analyzed its strengths and weaknesses, and understood that the P-47 couldn't fight like a Spitfire or Messerschmitt. It didn't need to. The Thunderbolt was designed around different principles, and pilots who tried to dogfight with it at low altitude were playing to its weaknesses instead of its strengths. He began drilling his pilots in energy tactics, emphasizing altitude advantage, dive attacks, and zoom climbs. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The pilots remained unconvinced. They wanted proof that this flying milk bottle could actually fight. They would get that proof soon enough, though the cost would be measured in blood and burning aircraft. April 1943 would bring the P-47 into combat, and German pilots would get their first good look at their new opponent. The laughter would begin almost immediately, but it wouldn't last long. First blood, April 15, 1943, the date when the P-47 Thunderbolt finally met the Luftwaffe in combat. Don Blakesley, leading a section of the 4th Fighter Group, spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 below him near Calais. The German pilot was so focused on setting up an attack on bombers that he never saw the massive American fighter diving on him from above. Blakesley opened fire at close range, his 8 machine guns blazing. The Focke-Wulf exploded in a brilliant flash of fire and debris. The P-47 had drawn first blood. But victory came with a bitter aftertaste. The mission cost the 4th Fighter Group 1 P-47 shot down and 2 others lost to engine failure. The Germans claimed several more American fighters damaged. The exchange rate was tilted heavily against the Americans. Worse, the Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit the P-47's weaknesses. They attacked from below, where the heavy Thunderbolt struggled to follow. They forced turning fights at medium altitudes, where agility mattered more than firepower. They climbed steeply after attacks, leaving the ponderous American fighters wallowing behind. Hauptmann Joseph Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, filed a contemptuous report to his superiors after his first encounters with the P-47. "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter," he wrote. "It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. They might carry heavy machine guns, but you have to hit the enemy first, and these things can't catch a cold, let alone a Focke-Wulf. The statistics from April and May 1943 seem to confirm German confidence. American fighter groups flying P-47s lost 14 Thunderbolts in their first month of operations, for only 3 confirmed German kills. The exchange rate was nearly 5-to-1 against the Americans. RAF pilots, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested that perhaps the Americans should reconsider their choice of fighter. British humor being what it was, someone joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around inside the roomy cockpit. But something strange was happening in those early encounters. Something German intelligence failed to notice or understand. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. Aircraft were returning from missions with 20, 30, even 50 cannon and machine gun holes punched through their airframes. Damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt or even a Spitfire was being shrugged off by the massive American fighters. The radial engine proved nearly invulnerable to battle damage. Unlike the liquid-cooled engines in German and British fighters, which depended on complex cooling systems with vulnerable radiators, the R-2800 could lose entire cylinders and keep running. There was no coolant to leak, no radiator to be punctured. Pilots discovered they could bring home P-47s with multiple cylinders shot away, oil spraying everywhere, and still make controlled landings at base. More significantly, when P-47s managed to get their guns on target, the results were absolutely devastating. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a zone of destruction, unlike anything German pilots had experienced. The 8 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, harmonized to converge at 300 yards, could put out a combined 100 rounds per second. At convergence distance, all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected in a cone, roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything caught in that cone faced a literal wall of lead traveling at 2,900 feet per second. One encounter in early May provided a glimpse of what was coming. A flight of 4 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group caught a formation of Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine fighters positioning to attack B-17 bombers. Major David Schilling led his flight in a diving attack from 28,000 feet. The Messerschmitt 110s, heavily armed but less maneuverable than single-engine fighters, never had a chance. Schilling's first burst caught one 110 in the wing root. The German fighter literally came apart in mid-air, wings separating from the fuselage, tail section severed, the crew compartment shredded into aluminum confetti. In less than 2 seconds, a combat aircraft became a cloud of burning debris. Lieutenant Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the surviving Messerschmitt 110s, was interviewed after being shot down later that month. His testimony provides a German perspective on encountering P-47 firepower for the first time. "The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven," he recalled. "I opened fire at 800 meters. I saw my rounds strike the fighter's wing. Good hits. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply ceased to exist. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage, tails severed, everything shredded. In 2 seconds, a 110 became nothing but falling debris." This was the pattern that would repeat thousands of times over the next 2 years. German pilots would score hits that seemed fatal, only to watch the P-47 absorb the damage and keep flying. Then the American fighter would get its guns on target for just a second or two, and the German aircraft would explode. It was like fighting something that couldn't be hurt but could kill you with a single touch. American pilots were slowly learning to exploit the P-47's true strengths. They climbed high before missions, using that massive engine and turbo supercharger to reach altitudes where German fighters struggled. Then they dove on their opponents from above, building tremendous speed that made deflection shooting nearly impossible for the defenders. At the bottom of the dive, they'd unleash those 8 machine guns for a brief, brutal burst, then use their energy to zoom climb back to altitude. The Luftwaffe was beginning to realize they had a problem, but the true revelation of just how serious that problem was came on a summer afternoon over the French countryside, when a young American pilot named Robert Johnson demonstrated exactly how tough the P-47 really was. The indestructible Thunder. June 26, 1943. Lieutenant Robert Johnson was having one of the worst days of his life, and it was about to get infinitely worse. Flying at the rear of his formation near Forges-les-Eaux, France, he just watched 16 Focke-Wulf 190s bounce his squadron from above. The first pass scattered the American fighters like leaves in a storm. Johnson's P-47, positioned at the tail end of the 61st Squadron, took the brunt of the initial attack. The first shells hit him before he even knew the Germans were there. 20-millimeter cannon rounds exploded into his fuselage, each one packing the punch of a grenade. His hydraulic system ruptured instantly, spraying pressurized fluid throughout the cockpit. The canopy shattered into thousands of crystal fragments. A machine gun round grazed his nose, drawing blood. Shrapnel from a cannon shell buried itself in his right leg. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel, filling the cockpit with acrid smoke. The P-47 rolled inverted and began falling in a violent spin, trailing flames and smoke. Johnson, temporarily blinded by hydraulic fluid in his eyes and choking on smoke, fought to regain control. His training kicked in through the panic. Left rudder to stop the spin. Ease back on the stick. The fire went out as suddenly as it had started. The big radial engine, despite taking multiple hits, kept running in its steady, reassuring roar. Johnson leveled out at lower altitude, pointing the battered fighter toward England and the English Channel. He tried to open the canopy to bail out. It wouldn't budge. A 20-millimeter shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was trapped in a dying aircraft with no way out. Through the oil-streaked windscreen he could barely see. His controls responded sluggishly. Every instrument on the panel either read 0 or was spinning uselessly. But the engine kept running, and that meant he had a chance. Then he saw the Focke-Wulf. A lone FW-190 had followed him down, watching the crippled Thunderbolt limp toward safety. The German pilot, whose identity has never been conclusively determined despite years of research, positioned himself behind Johnson's tail and opened fire. 4 20-millimeter cannons and 2 machine guns emptied their ammunition into the stricken P-47. Johnson could only huddle behind his armor plate and pray. The Thunderbolt shuddered under the impacts. Cannon shells exploded against the armor plating behind his seat, each hit feeling like being kicked by a mule. Shells tore through the wings, punctured the fuselage, shredded control surfaces. Machine gun bullets walked up and down the aircraft's spine. Johnson counted the impacts, each one another mortal wound that somehow didn't kill him. The German emptied his cannon ammunition. The firing stopped. Johnson dared to glance back and saw the Focke-Wulf pulling alongside, the pilot staring in absolute disbelief at the flying wreck that should have been falling debris. Johnson could see the German pilot's face clearly. Young, blonde, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear or wonder. How was this thing still flying? The German pilot repositioned and opened fire again, this time with only his machine guns, the cannons empty. He poured hundreds of rounds into the Thunderbolt. The aircraft shook and rattled, metal screaming as bullets tore through aluminum skin. Still, it flew. The engine, that magnificent Pratt & Whitney R2800, absorbed direct hits and kept turning. The rugged construction, all those pounds of extra weight that made the P-47 so heavy, was now keeping Johnson alive. The German pilot pulled alongside a second time, shaking his head in apparent amazement. He gave what looked like an informal salute, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, then peeled away. Whether he ran out of ammunition or simply couldn't believe what he was seeing, the attack was over. Johnson was still alive, still flying, miraculously still headed toward England. Guiding the battered P-47 with what little control authority remained, Johnson made radio contact with ground control. They vectored him toward RAF Manston, a base on the English coast. The landing was more controlled crash than proper landing, but Johnson got the aircraft down in one piece. The engine finally quit on the runway, having given everything it had to bring its pilot home. The ground crew chief started counting bullet and cannon holes, then gave up after reaching 200. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head, stopped only by the armored glass windscreen. Another had detonated directly against the armor plate behind his seat, which had absorbed the blast that should have killed him. The engine had taken multiple direct hits. Control cables were partially severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot through. The fuel tank had been punctured multiple times. By any rational analysis, Johnson should have been dead. His aircraft should have fallen from the sky in pieces. Instead, both had survived an encounter that would have destroyed any other fighter of the era, Allied or German. When news of Johnson's survival spread through both air forces, reactions were divided. American pilots gained confidence in their mounts, realizing they were flying tanks that could absorb punishment no other fighter could endure. German pilots received combat reports and intelligence assessments with growing concern. What kind of aircraft could survive that kind of damage? The photographs of Johnson's P-47 after that mission were distributed throughout the 8th Air Force. Pilots studied them in briefing rooms, counting the holes, examining the damage. The message was clear. The P-47 could take a beating that would obliterate any other fighter and bring you home. But there was another message too, one that American pilots were just beginning to understand. If the P-47 could survive that much punishment, imagine what those 8 machine guns could do to an enemy that lacked such protection. The transformation in German attitudes began that summer. The fat American fighters weren't so funny anymore, and American pilots, finally understanding their aircraft's true nature, were learning to fight the way the Thunderbolt demanded. The Luftwaffe was about to discover what it meant to face an opponent that couldn't be killed, but could kill you with a single burst. The age of the Thunderbolt was beginning, and the sky over Europe would never be the same. Thunder from above. By July 1943, American tactics had evolved from desperate survival to calculated lethality. Hub Zemke's drilling and energy tactics was paying dividends. P-47 pilots stopped trying to turn with German fighters and started dictating the terms of engagement. They climbed to 30,000 feet and higher, altitudes where the turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine maintained full power while German fighters gasped. Then they waited, circling like hawks, looking for prey below. The German fighters, tied to defending bomber formations, couldn't avoid combat. They had to attack the American bombers, which meant flying predictable courses at medium altitudes. The P-47s would watch them set up their attacks, then roll inverted and dive. From 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt could reach speeds exceeding 550 miles per hour. faster than any German fighter could achieve even in a vertical dive. This speed made deflection shooting nearly impossible. You couldn't lead a target moving that fast. At the bottom of these power dives, the American pilots would level out briefly, put their gun sights on a German fighter, and press the trigger. A 1 or 2 second burst from 8 .50 caliber machine guns delivered between 150 and 300 rounds into a target area the size of a small car. Aircraft caught in this cone of fire didn't just go down, they came apart. Wings separated from fuselages, engines were torn from their mounts, cockpits were shredded. Pilots died before they even understood they'd been hit. Then the P-47 would use its tremendous speed to zoom climb back to altitude, its massive weight and power allowing it to convert velocity into height faster than pursuing German fighters could follow. By the time German pilots tried to chase, the American fighter was already back at 30,000 feet, ready to dive again. It was boom and zoom tactics perfected, and it was brutally effective. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 56th Fighter Group became one of the early masters of this technique, which pilots called the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. He'd climb to 32,000 feet, higher than the bombers, higher than the German fighters, higher than any practical combat had previously been fought. Then he'd wait with the patience of a sniper. When a German formation appeared below, he'd roll inverted, use the rudder to point the nose down, and push the throttle through the gate for war emergency power. The water injection system would dump water and methanol into the engine, temporarily boosting output to 2,300 horsepower. The dive was a controlled fall, the airspeed indicators spinning clockwise toward numbers that made new pilots nervous. 400 miles per hour, 450, 500. The airframe would begin to buffet as it approached compressibility, the controls getting heavier, harder to move. But you didn't need fine control for this. You just needed to get close enough for the guns. Pull out of the dive. Not too hard or you'd black out from G-forces. See the target in your sight picture. Press the trigger. The aircraft would slow by 20 to 30 miles per hour from the recoil alone, as 8 machine guns hurled lead at 6,000 rounds per minute combined. Hold the trigger for 2 seconds. That's it. 2 seconds of fire. Then throttle up, pull back on the stick, and climb away before anyone could react. German pilots who survived these attacks described facing a wall of bullets. Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Kroschinski of Jagdgeschwader 11 was shot down twice by P-47s using this tactic. He survived both times, barely, and his testimony after the war provides insight into what it felt like to be on the receiving end. "You never saw them coming," he recalled. "You'd be setting up to attack the bombers, concentrating on your approach, and suddenly there would be this noise. Not the crack of individual bullets, but a continuous tearing sound, like fabric being ripped. Then your aircraft would be shaking, pieces flying off, and you'd have maybe 1 second to react before you were dead or bailing out. If you heard that sound, you were already hit. The P-47's guns didn't give you warning shots, they gave you funeral arrangements." The lethality of the 850 caliber battery became legendary. Each gun fired standard M2 ball ammunition mixed with armor-piercing incendiary and armor-piercing incendiary tracer rounds in a standard 5-round belt pattern. The armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the armor protection on German fighters at typical combat ranges. The incendiary component burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum structure, fuel, and hydraulic fluid. At the standard convergence distance of 300 yards, all 8 guns' trajectories intersected in a killing zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Put differently, A P-47 pilot who centered his gun sight on an enemy fighter and held the trigger for 2 seconds would place approximately 200 projectiles through an area smaller than the cockpit. No aircraft could survive that. No human pilot could react in time. And the Luftwaffe learned that lesson the hard way. By late 1943, the German fighter arm was bleeding to death in the skies over Europe. Every bomber stream now came escorted by squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts orbiting high above, invisible until it was too late. German pilots began reporting a new sound in combat briefings. Not the crack of individual bullets, not the thud of cannon shells, but a single, horrifying noise. A ripping, continuous roar that lasted only a second or two. If you heard it, you were already dying. The laughter was gone. German pilots stopped calling the P-47 barrels. They stopped mocking its shape. In combat reports, a new tone emerged: caution, respect, and finally, fear. The Thunderbolt was no longer a curiosity. It was a predator. A machine that could dive faster than anything in the sky, absorb punishment that would annihilate other fighters, and deliver concentrated firepower with mathematical certainty. And the mathematics were merciless. A P-47 pilot needed only one firing pass, 2 seconds on the trigger. That was enough to cut a fighter in half, enough to rip an engine from its mounts, enough to turn a veteran ace into falling wreckage before he even understood he was under attack. By early 1944, the exchange ratios had flipped completely. What began as 5-to-1 losses against the Americans became 5-to-1 losses against the Germans. The Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, men who had survived Poland, France, Britain, Russia, were being erased from the sky by young Americans flying aircraft that refused to die. The Thunderbolt did more than shoot down fighters. It broke the Luftwaffe's spine. As American bomber escorts pushed deeper into Germany, the P-47 expanded its role. It strafed airfields, destroyed trains, shattered armored columns, and turned German logistics into burning wreckage. Its heavy armor, radial engine, and sheer mass made it uniquely suited for ground attack. Pilots came home with half their wings shredded, cylinders shot away, control surfaces barely hanging on, and the aircraft still brought them back. German ground troops learned to recognize the Thunderbolt by silhouette alone. A large, blunt nose, broad wings, and then the sound, the scream of a diving engine followed by the thunder of machine guns. To the men on the ground, it wasn't a fighter, it was an executioner. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 P-47s had been built. They flew over 700,000 combat sorties. They destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. More importantly, they escorted the bombers that shattered Germany's industrial heart and made Allied victory inevitable. The aircraft that German pilots laughed at in April 1943 became one of the most lethal machines ever to fly, not because it was elegant, not because it was nimble, but because it was relentless. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed to win dogfights. It was designed to survive them. And in surviving, again and again, it buried the Luftwaffe beneath an avalanche of lead, fire, and industrial power. The flying barrel didn't just silence the laughter, it ended the war in the sky.